St. Thomas Aquinas asks the question, what's the right relationship to have with God? He wants us all to know that so we can have that. In order to know that, we have to know some details about God. One of the first is, does God exist? Well, he begins by trying to answer the question, is God self-evident? Now, his examples are all out of Scripture, and I'm not going to bore you with them because that's just appeal to authority. It might make for good theology, but it's bad philosophy. However, he does conclude that God is not self-evident for very good logical reasons. He says a thing is self-evident in one of two ways. Either it's self-evident in itself, though not to us, or it is self-evident in itself and to us. Now, a proposition is self-evident when the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. So I say man is an animal. Well, that's okay because animal is part of the essence of man. If on the other hand, I'm trying to make a claim to say something is good or not, well, that's not likely to be an essential quality of it. It's going to be something perhaps it should have, something it should attain to, but we wouldn't even talk about something being good unless something could also be bad, in which event clearly it's not an essential nature of the thing. Thus, the goodness of a thing won't be self-evident. The proposition that God exists, he says, is self-evident, but not to us. To us, we will need a demonstration. Why is it not self-evident to us? Because we don't understand what the essence of God is. In order to make it self-evident, we'd have to know the essence. Remember, things that are self-evident are things where the predicate is contained in the subject. God exists because we don't know what God is. We don't know that the predicate is contained in the subject, and he's going to do his best to describe the ways in which we can know something about what it means to say God exists and what the essence of God is. He's going to prove that God exists. Now, in proving that, he will be teaching us what the essential qualities of God are. Once we know what those essential qualities are, and we see that those qualities imply existence of a necessity, then we will be able to know that God exists. See? It will become self-evident. The fact that a proof was required doesn't mean that it wasn't self-evident to start with. It merely, the proof is there to teach us what the essence of God is so that we can understand that the self-evidence is there. That sounded a little much. Let me say it one more time. Something is self-evident when the predicate is contained in the subject. It's not clear that the existence of God is contained in the word, the meaning of God. So we're going to show 5 different ways in which God has to contain the quality of existence, because these will turn out to be themselves, these qualities, of necessity existent. And therefore, if these are the qualities of God, then God has to exist, okay? Okay, well, let's go ahead and we'll try it again after you've heard the proofs, all right? The first way is, as he describes it, the argument from motion. That is to say simply that in this world, things move. Things don't move necessarily. There has to be an impetus to cause the change, to cause the motion. Now, I can cause the motion of a billiard ball by striking it with a pool cue. But what put me into motion? Well, we could say parents and go up that ladder. We could say interests and go up that ladder. But anyway we look, there is a regress of motion going backwards. And we have to explain why each of these motions started. We get back to the very first motion, and that, he says, all men call God. Well, that's kind of a problem locution for me. One, I don't see why the first mover should be called God. Indeed, I don't know why it should be called anything at all other than first mover. But that's where he goes, and that's where he'll stay. All of his arguments are essentially sorts of infinite regress arguments. Well, that's not true. Many of his arguments are essentially infinite regress arguments. There has to be an original cause, an original quality, an original device that explains everything. And this all men call God. This one is one of the most questionable. After all, he is basically mimicking Aristotle's proof of the existence of a first mover. And as I recall, he arrives at either 34 or 37 first movers, not one. And he certainly didn't call his first movers God at all. So why should all men call that first mover God when the originator of the argument, Aristotle, didn't? The second argument, okay, first we have to have a first motion. The second argument, we have to have a first cause. Everything is caused. Nothing comes from nothing. So there has to be an initial cause, and that cause is all men call God. Again, it's not clear that anyone actually does, think of God as the first cause, the initial cause. Likewise, it's not clear that we couldn't arrive at multiple initial causes, independent sources of cause that themselves cause everything else, but not each other. Well, there's his argument from efficient cause, first cause. Now, the third method is much more interesting. In the third method, he says, look, if we take a look at everything in the universe, does it have to be there? Or is it contingent in its existence? Is it merely something that's been possible and is? Could have been something else, but it's this. It's just not a necessary quality of the universe. He says, but if everything is contingent, everything is merely possible, then it was possible there was nothing instead of something. But there is something, and there has to be something. Therefore, there must be some one necessary thing, and that one necessary thing all men call God. One, that move away from everything being contingent doesn't seem to be completely reliable. It does seem that we could have just a series of contingencies where something sort of wandered into place and then it gave rise to something else, it gave rise to something else. Also the case that the first argument, the immediate previous argument, was that everything has a cause and causes have necessary effects. That being the case, then the world isn't contingent, it's necessary. It has to be what it is because that first cause set things out. Well, that's one of the great quandaries of examining Aquinas' 5 ways. It's not clear whether they're intended to be 5 separate ways, 5 complementary ways. I've heard it argued that there's supposed to be 5 concatenating approaches. That is to say, no one is enough, but if you take all 5 together, you're kind of left with God. Even though each is separate of the other, it's the overwhelming evidence, if you will, of these proofs. Now, anyway, that's his argument from necessity. Now, the next is the idea of gradation. That is to say that there has to be a greatest thing in every category. Thus, there has to be a greatest category. Because if there's a greatest thing in each category, then the top category of that is category, right? So there has to be a greatest category. The contents of that greatest category is going to be the greatest thing. Well, the greatest thing in the contents is the greatest category, but the greatest category, because it's the greatest category, can only have one thing in it. If it had more than one, then it wouldn't be the greatest, because it would have two components to it, and thus one or the other would be greater. In the greatest category, there can only be the greatest things, and therefore one thing there. And that greatest content, and that greatest category that we need in order to understand all the less great things beneath it is God. I'm not so sure on that one either. It's not clear to me. I mean, he gives an example, fire, that there are lesser fires and greater fires, and thus the category of fire is greater than those things there. Well, it's not clear that anything else is like God. I mean, even if we accept what the Bible has to say, man is made in God's image. Well, that's not the same as being in the same category as God. I make a statue in my image. It's not a person. It's not a living thing. It's just an image. An image doesn't necessarily belong in the same category as the thing it's an image of. If God is the only thing, and we've said he is, then how do we compare ourselves to God? How do we fit in on the gradation scale? Well, he suggests it's in terms of existence, but existence is what we're trying to prove. All right, anyway. Now the fifth way he tries to prove the existence of God is to say that the universe needs a maker. It is clear that the universe is somehow behaving according to laws. At this point, we have just a little bit of a equivocation here. He says, the fifth way is taken from the governments of all things. Now, if I have a governor, a regulator on my car that keeps the speed down to a certain level. We used to have those anyway. I don't know if they have those anymore or not. That governor wasn't a lawgiver. It was simply something that regulated how things ran, kept the temperature down. It didn't make laws. It just simply kept the laws in place, if you will. Thus, the governance of all things requires no lawgiver per se. It merely says, here are rules, here are laws, and let's behave. We will behave, not we must behave. We will behave because we can't help but behave accordingly. So, again, it's not clear that any such inference to God exists. And again, whoever thought of God as a governor on my carburetor to keep my car down to a certain speed? Nobody, I think. Aquinas' 5 ways were his attempt to describe the nature of God, though. So let's take a look at what he's trying to say about God. God is, working backwards, the governor of all things. He is the source of perfection. He is necessary. He is the first cause and the first mover. He is the impetus force of the universe. See, I was saying, if you've seen me on the Stoics, you'll see what I'm saying about the Stoics' logos. This is an excellent classification of a logos. I'm not sure that it's a proof of a logos, but it doesn't vaguely resemble the guy who hands out the 10 Commandments. It's just a bunch of principles that we say are necessary when it's not even clear that those principles are necessary, let alone divine or divinely ordained. Well, I hope it's something for you to think about. I know it's something for you to talk about. Keep on talking philosophy.